Alright, motherfucker. You're gonna answer for that Freddy's dead bullshit right fucking now! Wes Craven's New Nightmare tells the story of Freddy Krueger trying to escape the Nightmare on Elm Street films into our reality, but before he can do that, he must take down his arch nemesis, Nancy. Well, we're back on our upswing, everybody. We are out of the pits of hell of Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare, and back up on top of the mountain with all the great Nightmare on Elm Street movies. And honestly, Wes Craven's New Nightmare is the last great Nightmare on Elm Street movie. So after Freddy's dead, New Line realized that there is still some life left in Freddy and in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. The fans are still salivating for him. So Rob Shea approached Wes Craven and said, dude, we've got to iron out our differences. We need to collaborate. We need to bring you back, and we need to do the definitive Nightmare movie. We need to come back on top. So Rob Shea gave Wes Craven a lot of the royalties from the earlier movies. He gave him some other things that he's been wanting for a while to iron out their financial differences, and then he gave him carte blanche to write this new Nightmare film. Now, the idea for this Nightmare film actually came to fruition sometime whenever Wes Craven was approached to co-write the third installment, Dream Warriors, but back in the 80s, New Line wasn't having anything to do with this type of storyline. And to be honest with you, it's probably a good idea they did that, because even in 1994, this was a little bit ahead of its time, and we'll get into that. So Wes Craven looked at the franchise after he left it. He looked at Dream Master, he looked at Dream Child, he looked at the horrid mess of Freddy's Dead, and said, I have no idea what the hell to do with this thing to go in a unique direction. I have no idea where to take this. I have no idea how to follow that shit. And then the idea of New Nightmare came to him, and he said, you know what? I've never seen anything like this. I think it's going to work. Let's go for it. And undoubtedly, this is the most creative and best written installment of the Nightmare franchise since Dream Warriors. It started the whole meta storyline aspect of filmmaking where the films coincide with reality. It asks a really interesting question about the people who create and make horror movies and franchises like this, the effect that it has on them in their real life. It begs the question that people that make a classic movie like A Nightmare on Elm Street, do they ever truly exist beyond that film after that thing is taken off and everybody loves it? Do they? It also incorporates a lot of elements of the old Grimm storyline of Hansel and Gretel really interestingly. And ultimately, the movie is just effective, it's creative, it's engaging, and it's a big love letter and fan service to Nightmare fans without detracting from the effect of the movie and the storyline one bit.
Be carried into the midst of the sea. At the tempest of... It's
arguably the best looking and the best shot film in the entire franchise. There's just some really great iconic shots, like whenever Freddy's at the press conference and he's moving his gloves and you see the silhouette move over the spotlights, the scene whenever Heather Langenkamp is sliding through the bed into the dream world to find her son. Just really cool stuff. And as a Nightmare fanatic, I really appreciate and love the aspects of this film that kind of pays tribute to that original movie. Like the opening of the film, when it's a mimic of the very opening scene, whenever Freddy's creating his glove, like whenever Freddy's hand comes out of the bed, whenever Tina's death is kind of recreated towards the end. A lot of elements that you'll see really mimic and kind of parallel a lot of things that was iconic about the first Nightmare on Elm Street. The movie takes a much different approach to the pace and to the dynamic of how they tell the story. It's a really slow burn, but a nice build to an eventual just explosion of a confrontation in the third act. And the third act in this movie is bad ass. Freddy's Temple, or at least that's what I refer to it as, is one of the coolest and most atmospheric scenes and settings in this entire franchise. Another aspect of this movie that they pulled off really well too, considering that they didn't really rip off the original score of the Nightmare on Elm Street movie, is the score in the New Nightmare is actually pretty damn good. It's got a much different dynamic to it than the older movies, and it just really moves along with the pace of the film really well. Don't get me wrong, it does utilize some of the elements of the original Nightmare on Elm Street score, but it takes it in a lot of new directions, and I thought that was a cool and unique way to also, just like the rest of the movie, pay tribute, but do something wildly different. Moving on to the performances in this, of course, we have Heather Langenkamp back in the driver's seat as our main heroine. She's playing herself rather than playing Nancy, and she probably gives the best performance of her entire career in this franchise in The New Nightmare. She is emotional, she is strong, just like she's always been strong, but even taken it to a new level, and she is probably the most driven as a character in The New Nightmare than she has ever been. Miko Hughes is in this as our young son Dylan. A lot of us recognize him as Gage from Pet Sematary, and he also does really well. He was one of the better child actors of that era. And this kid, you don't ever hear from him or see him, and you don't really see too much credit given to him too much. But you know what? He's kind of a horror icon in his own right, because to play Gage, such an iconic character, and be such a cornerstone of a great movie like this, that kid was really important to horror in the 80s and the 90s.
7, 8, better stay up late.
Dylan, don't sing that song.
19, never sleep.
John Saxon is also back in this, playing himself and also playing Nancy's father towards the end when the reality starts to kind of transition into the dream world. And his two scenes with Heather Langenkamp are some of the best parts of this movie, because it really kind of builds upon and plays on that whole father-daughter dynamic. Even though they're not father and daughter in real life, they still have that kind of a relationship. And the scene with them in the park and him trying to console her and being very father-like is a really great scene. And also the scene whenever, like I said, reality starts to kind of transition into the dream world and he goes from being John Saxon and kind of morphs into Nancy's father. Another great cornerstone scene of this movie.
Now, don't start losing it like your mother did. I love you, sweetheart. Don't forget that.
I love you too, Daddy.
Another actress I want to give a little bit of credit to as well, because she is damn good in this and plays a really heavy part in that second half of this movie, is Fran Bennett. She's the one who plays Dylan's doctor, and she is great because she has this really natural charisma of this healer. Like, you believe that this woman is a doctor and somebody that would devote her life to the medical practitioner, and she really wants to help Dylan, she really wants to help Heather Langenkamp, but there's a subtle little piece of sinister in her voice. And a part of that is like this suspicion, like her bullshit meter's kind of going off on whether or not Heather Langenkamp is crazy, or if she's like part of the reason why Dylan is in so much trouble. And that's a really important dynamic to have for that character, because the craziness of this entire situation needs to be called out by some character, and she does a good job at being that character. An interesting fact about her character, her name is Dr. Hefner, and no, it's not off of Playboy's Hugh Hefner. He actually named that character, Wes Craven named it after somebody who was one of the big wigs of the MPAA. So it's kind of this neat little parallel from, again, the dream world or the movie world and the real world, because all of the things that Dr. Hefner is telling Heather Langenkamp about, you let your son see your films, and all these little subtle little shaming lines, seems like they are taken directly out of the MPAA shaming horror directors and horror actresses and horror creators.
The man from your films? Freddy Krueger? With the claws? Is that who he's afraid of? You have let your child see your films, haven't you?
And of course, I can't talk about performances without spending a little bit of time on my man Robert Englund. And this is Robert Englund getting back to the roots of Freddy. There is not a comical side to this Freddy. He is very dark, very maniacal, very evil, and very sinister. He has a little bit of a subtle one-liner here and there, but they're not meant to be funny. They're meant to disturb the hell out of you.
Pick a pet. What a rugrat, bitch.
And Robert Englund is great. Not only is he great at playing himself, because the actor Robert Englund does play a sizable role in this story, but whenever he finally gets to reveal himself as Freddy, it is just great. It's just a love letter to those that love that original Nightmare on Elm Street Freddy, where he is not a stand-up comedian. He is there to fuck with your head.
It's been giving me Freddy nightmares.
Wait a second. Now, let me get this straight. You're having nightmares about Freddy? As in me?
No, it isn't you. He's scarier. He's...
Darker. More evil?
yeah. How did you know?
Call it a guess.
And I really love the new look of Freddy in this. They give him a much different look. His skin looks a little bit more like it's been split and torn more than it's been burned. He wears a blackish blue trench coat, which is an interesting look. His claw is much less of a handmade claw and much more of a piece of his actual arm. It's got like bones and muscles and everything to it. It's a really wild look, and I'm actually surprised that we have yet to go back to that design of Freddy, because I think it's one of the best Freddy looks that we've seen. Unfortunately though, despite all of the great things about this movie, it didn't really land with audiences back in 1994. It was critically acclaimed for the most part. It was a really well-reviewed movie for its time, but it didn't quite land with audiences, and it didn't quite get the box office that they were expecting. And honestly, that's because the concepts that they really went for in this movie was ahead of its time. 2 years later, Wes revisited this type of storyline in Scream, and partially because that aspect of storytelling was a little bit more comedic and probably a little bit easier to swallow, but also because it focused on teenagers, the people who were really going to see these movies rather than adults and filmmakers, it landed a lot more and really blew up whenever it came to us in the form of Scream. Whereas in Wes Craven's New Nightmare, people just didn't know how to accept this movie. It's a Freddy movie, but it's kind of not a Freddy movie. It's a movie, but it's kind of in real life, and it's just very ambitious, unique, and really creative and smart concepts that honestly just we weren't ready for yet. Now, aside from the fact that we weren't quite ready for this type of storytelling yet, there are a few flaws with Wes Craven's New Nightmare. As far as some of the acting, this isn't really a huge standout issue in this movie, but you have real life producers and directors playing actual characters and trying to act in this movie, like Robert Shaye and Wes Craven.
It was a script. It was a dream. I didn't know.
You know damn well it's more than that now.
And they don't do terrible, but they definitely stand out amongst Heather Langenkamp and Robert Englund and even Miko Hughes in a lot of ways. So they're a kind of a stand out like a sore thumb type of performance where you see it and you're like, okay, yeah, that works, I guess.
Oh, come on, Heather. Kids love horror.
The CGI effects in this movie have not aged very well at all, like some of the things involving the highway scene, and especially the scene in the very end, which I'm going to go a little bit more in depth whenever Freddy kind of turns into a demon and then melts. It looks really bad when you watch it now. And even though in a lot of ways I really appreciate the way that this movie is methodical and really slowly builds up to this huge confrontation between Nancy or Heather Langenkamp and Freddy Krueger, it's a bit of a slow burn, and it's not going to work for everybody. You don't even see Freddy until an hour and 8 minutes into this film, and that's not going to land very well with people who come to this movie specifically to see Freddy take people out. Speaking of Freddy taking people out, I feel like the kills in this movie are a little lackluster too. I know that's not the cornerstone of the point of the movie. That's not really what they were going for, is these big inventive kills, but at the end of the day, it's a slasher movie, it's a Freddy Krueger movie, it's a horror movie. You gotta have some creative kills in there. And more so, they kind of focus on paying homage to the original movie than they did trying to be creative and new with the kills. Aside from the dream sequence at the very beginning of the movie, all of the kills that we get in this movie in some way is a homage to one of the older kills. Like the one in the car is kind of an homage to Dan's death in a way. The one where Julie gets killed is a direct homage to Tina's death in the first movie.
Hey, Dylan. Ever play Skin the Cat?
And those are really the only two deaths that we see on screen at all. There's some other deaths that apparently happen off screen, but we don't get to see them. And that's 2 deaths in an hour and 45 movie. I don't know if that's enough, guys. And speaking of deaths, I feel like the death of Freddy Krueger in this movie is pretty weak overall. It's not a death that I really remember all that much. It's not really a fitting death, especially for how much they build up how strong and evil Freddy is in this movie. It's way too heavy-handed, in my opinion, with directly adapting the ending, the climax of the Hansel and Gretel storyline, where they push the witch into the oven. It's basically the same thing here. They push Freddy into a small little room, lock him into it where flames are starting to come up, and then he turns into a demon and melts. And it's just like, damn, that kind of fizzled out. And like I said, it doesn't help that the CGI in that scene is pretty bad. Now, continuing with the trend that I have set forth with all of these Nightmare on Elm Street reviews, I'm going to choose my favorite or scariest scene in Wes Craven's New Nightmare. And for the first time in this review series, guys, I have a tie. The first winner for favorite scene is actually the opening of this movie. Not only the sequence whenever they are directly paying homage to the opening of the original Nightmare on Elm Street when they're creating the claw, and then all of a sudden it just spins into what this movie is going to be, and the camera pans out and you realize it's somebody actually filming a movie. And then you get introduced to how this storyline is going to play out, and it's really cool, and it's a really interesting way that they kind of throw everybody up for a loop, and they really pull the rug out from under you for what you expect. But what the scene follows is whenever the Claw really starts to get a mind of its own and starts killing and tearing through all the effects guys. Not only because that's the goriest and the coolest kills that we get in this movie, but again, it just pulls the rug out from under you because you're in Freddy's world, then you're in a movie making world, and then all of a sudden you're in a horror movie again, and it becomes a big dream sequence all in the end, which is one of the few times that I will forgive a dream sequence for being a dream sequence and choose it as my favorite scene in a movie. But the second scene that is my favorite scene in this movie is very small, but it's so important, and that's when Nancy first sees Freddy, whenever he pulls the clothes back in the closet and says, "Miss me?" Yeah, motherfucker, you have no idea how badly we missed you. So to wrap all this up, guys, Wes Craven's New Nightmare is a really unique, really creative, and masterfully directed and written movie that is wildly different than anything else in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. It brings back the Freddy Krueger that we all know and love, the sinister, evil Freddy, not the comedic motherfucker, and it's just got a really great pace as far as slowly building up to this ultimate confrontation between our favorite final girl and our favorite horror icon. And it's just a great way to kind of cap off the series after the horrendous couple of sequels that we got preceding it. But in a lot of ways, it's a very subjective and divisive film. I think everybody will agree it's a well-made movie, but whether or not they actually enjoy it and want to revisit it numerous times is often a question where you hear a lot of different opinions on. Sometimes this movie is way too methodical, way too metaphorical, and way too over the heads of a lot of people that want to just enjoy a fun slasher movie. Sometimes people look at this and they see just a genius work of art, and whether or not you end up on one side of the coin or the other side really depends on your answer to this question. And I'll give my answers to those questions as well. Is Wes Craven's New Nightmare a great movie? Yes, definitely, it's a great movie. Is Wes Craven's A New Nightmare a great Freddy movie? It's good. So you know what side of that coin you fall on. If you want to see a straight up slasher, I definitely say stick with the original or Dream Warriors, but if you just want to see a great movie and a really unique spin on this character, absolutely go out and buy it. So what do you guys think of Wes Craven's A New Nightmare? Is this a return to form for Wes Craven and for Freddy, or is this way too methodical and metaphorical and too slow building for you if you just want to check out a fun slasher Freddy Krueger movie? What is your thoughts? Put them all down below on Wes Craven's New Nightmare and we'll talk about it. Please like and share this video, hit that subscribe button, and if you want to check out some of my social media links like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and my new Patreon page where I'm going to have exclusive content for patrons only, you can check out the links for all those down below. And if you want to check out some more of my videos, including the rest of this Nightmare on Elm Street franchise review, you can check out a few more by clicking right over here.